You're watching
West Hartford Community Television.
Community television.
For the community.
For the community.
By the community.
By the community.
And it's a wrap.
Hello and welcome to Shalom Hartford. Today I'm speaking to Richard Sugarman, the founding president of Connecticut Forum, along with his wife, Doris Sugarman. Today, he is the president of Hartford Promise. How does that happen? I'm Pat Kazakoff. You're watching Shalom Hartford. Stay with me and we're going to meet this Renaissance man, Richard Sugarman. So you were the founding director.
I don't know if I can make this Renaissance man thing happen, but I'll try. Go ahead.
Okay, well, we're going to go
try.
with that. So you were the founding president of Connecticut Forum.
Yeah.
And I'm listening to you, and I'm hearing a Southern accent.
You hear the Southern accent,
I
huh?
hear it.
I'm not
I
trying
hear
to hide. You wouldn't buy Southern Connecticut? You wouldn't?
No,
I couldn't
no,
get that
that's
past
not
you?
gonna happen.
All right. So I was born in Ohio. I was born in the most eastern part of Ohio, near Pennsylvania. And I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. We moved there when I was about 5 and a half. Grew up in Richmond.
Now I really hear it.
Yeah, when I talk about Richmond, when I
right,
talk about
right.
Richmond, and when I use words like M-I-L-E, mile,
Mile,
pile,
right.
That's when it comes out. But that's where you hear it. And I've been here for almost 30 years in Connecticut and in West Hartford. And but you keep your formative years accent, and so I'm happy to keep this actually.
You're doing now a lot what people, like kids talk about, the millennials. You're really the social entrepreneur.
I actually think of myself that way,
Yeah.
and I have for a long time, absolutely.
So
yes.
what in your...
Before there was the word social
Right,
entrepreneur.
right, because
yeah.
in your era there wasn't that word. This is a new word that the millennials have created. So what in your background, like growing up, how does your background look that led to this?
Well, I can look at an early starting point, but I would even go back before. So, my family is a very interesting working class family from, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, working class people, little towns that we all know about now or think we know about now, but that's where my family comes from.
When you say working class, what did your father do?
So my father he owned a little women's clothing store, in Weirton, West Virginia, a little steel town, and the big employer was Weirton Steel, and that's where everybody worked and everything revolved around Weirton Steel. And my grandfather owned a little auto parts store in Weirton, West Virginia, a little auto parts store.
So would we call that working class or would we just call it middle class?
Oh, no.
Oh, no?
I would say it was working class, but probably everybody in that part of the country was working class to one degree or another.
But you're entrepreneurial, because they were entrepreneurial people.
My father had a store, my grandfather had a store. I think the real story here, though, is that when my grandfather died at a fairly early age, my grandmother took over the auto parts store and continued to run it until she was 86 years old. And she commuted from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Weirton, West Virginia 3 or 4 days a week to run this auto parts store. That's what she did. That's what I grew up with, is a grandmother, is that kind of example of a person that you just do it. And why not do it? And it was relatively successful in terms of supporting her, supporting parts of our family. My mother, also was I would say a pioneer in business. My mother went to Ohio State University in the 40s during the war. She was in the School of Commerce, a school of business.
That's
she
unusual.
Very unusual, very few women. She was an honor student, a truly honored student at Ohio State, and was offered a position at Colgate-Palmolive as a woman in the management track at Colgate-Palmolive in the 40s.
We used to call it the management training program.
Right.
That's
Not
what
many
you said.
women in that program.
No.
At that time. So I grew up with great examples of men and women in my family who did things, who worked for things, who were prepared to take chances, to be sort of the pioneers, if you will, at things. That's just what I grew up with. So for me, that was the model. I would say the other piece of this that I think sort of launched me personally is that when we moved to Richmond, Virginia, I was too young to get into first grade in the public school system. So my parents looked for an alternative, and the alternative they found was Fork Union Military Academy. So when I moved to Richmond and I was, less than 6 years old, within a couple of weeks, they took me to Fork Union Military Academy. So I was the only person in the first grade at Fork Union Military Academy, and this was a boarding school. This was a school where you lived.
What was their narrative for doing that? Like, how did they? It's an unusual thing to do,
very,
especially for a Jewish boy.
Yes, it's very unusual for any boy.
For
certainly
anyone,
a Jewish
okay.
boy. It's very unusual. So I think the narrative, as it's been shared with me, is that they thought I was smart and that I was ready to be in first grade, and they really didn't want me to have to repeat kindergarten and be held back. They wanted me to be able to move ahead. And I think that's sort of the nature of our family. Let's not hold each other back, let's not hold ourselves back. And so they just felt like if this was the way for me to get into school and get into first grade, I think they were kind of blinded by the other consequences of this, and just wanted to make sure that I got into school. Because I have a very loving family, I have very loving parents and so on. But when you think about this, the idea of sending a child who's less than 6 years old away to a military school where, I didn't have any visitors for the first 90 days. I lived in a dorm with a footlocker and a bunk bed and marched to breakfast and marched to classes. And
you were the only child in the first grade?
I was the only first grade. I went to school with third and fourth graders because I think there was only one second grader. So it was me, a second grader, and then children who were older. Now you think of third and fourth graders as being the older kids at that point. These were all little children.
Well, I notice as you're telling the story that you're not saddened by it, that there is a certain amount of mirth as you're telling the story.
Yes, this is a good point, and I would say that it depends on how deeply I go with this story. So there's an element of this experience for me that is traumatic, and there's no way around that.
When you were doing it, or as you look back?
As I look back.
As you look back.
And maybe some as I was there. There's a certain sense of you're sent off to a strange place. You have no family around. You have no people that you know around. There's a certain amount of abandonment and sense of abandonment that comes with that, and a certain amount of trauma that comes with that sense of abandonment. And I'm going to say to you that at the time there were days and nights when I certainly felt that, and I needed to be comforted.
So how
But to me that was childhood. But there was a certain looking around and saying, where did my family go? Like, how did I get here? Why am I here? And there's a certain amount of I must have done something to get to this not particularly warm and pleasant and colorful place. I mean, everything was army green and dull, and I remember that. And I think later on, I have thought about that a lot. I have worked on that experience with my family. We've talked about this a lot with my father, who's still alive, my sister. And I think that one thing that I realize is that you can take an experience like that and it can make you bitter and angry and really wounded in the world. And I think for me, I took that experience as an experience to sort of launch me forward in a couple of ways. I'm able to get things done and get along. I have an expression, nothing as hard as Fork Union, okay? There'll be nothing for me as hard as Fork Union. And I keep that in mind, and I have a Post-it that I continuously look at that reminds me of that. But number two, it's made me, I think, really sensitive to people who might be in difficult circumstances, traumatized circumstances, abandoned circumstances, underprivileged circumstances.
You think that's how you translated it?
I am particularly sensitive to those people, and for me, it's just connected me to those people in all sorts of aspects of life and all sorts of groups to say, I connect with you, I relate to you, and I wonder if I can be helpful in some way.
And you relate that back to that Fork Union experience because that made you a bit of an outlier.
Oh, outlier's a good word for it. I definitely had to be able to get by on my own. I had to be able to get by with older people in a strange environment and be able to survive and get by. Yes.
Let's talk about how, with that experience in hand, now you go to high school, you go back to Richmond,
Yep.
and you go to
I was only there 1 year.
One
at military
year.
school. I was there 1 year just to be able to get started in first grade, and then the next year I was in second grade in a public school in Richmond, Virginia, and back with my family, and we moved on. But I brought that experience with me, right? So I was still, as a second grader, I had been around third, fourth, and fifth graders a lot. I was self-reliant to a great degree, and I guess I probably became a bit of a pioneer and maybe a little bit of a leader at things, and I was able to do things athletically. I was pretty good, and academically I was pretty good, so I was able to do things. And this sounds like I'm blowing my horn.
No,
but
no, I mean, it sounds like you're realistic, that you're seeing.
It's just as I look back on it, I was able to get by. I was able to do things that maybe other kids weren't able to do at that age.
How did the leadership display itself? What were you a leader in?
Well, I just wasn't afraid to try stuff. I wasn't, and some of that was me being mischievous. I mean, I was a rebel. So the other piece of this experience that goes with me is I was not great with authority figures. If somebody tried to give me orders, because here I am as a little kid at a military school and everybody's giving you orders, at some point you just resist that. You either, I guess, succumb completely or you resist. And with me, there was a certain amount of resistance to that. So I didn't do great with orders, and I was probably willing to take chances myself and be a bit of a rebel and do things and try things.
So what did you do that was rebellious that you can recall, where we would think it's rebellious?
Should I talk about those things? Let's see. Is it okay
Just one.
at this age?
One.
Okay.
Like, what was sort of out of the box?
So I like to. So I played golf. I was a golfer, and I played golf. And with me, I liked the competitiveness of it, and frankly, I didn't mind the idea of doing it. Sort of a lot of it is alone in practicing and so on. But I was curious about the caddies at the golf course because I didn't where were they from? And this goes back to this curiosity and this sense of who are these people and is there a way that I could be connected to them? So I was interested in the caddies, and they came from very poor circumstances, rural circumstances.
And in the South.
Nearby, in the South. So I would go and visit them. And I would go to their houses, and I would actually go out to their clubs, and I would go to their roadhouses. And in the morning, they would sit at the course before anybody was there, and they would sit and they would have a fire, and they would actually heat up whiskey to drink some whiskey to start the day.
It's a good way to start.
So I would do that with them, okay? And I hope that nobody saw me or found me because I was probably a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old kid. But I was very curious about these people, and I wanted to know their lives and know who they were. And I didn't want to just be the kid at the club, that was sort of privileged and playing golf. So that's an example, I guess.
And so,
Is that okay?
yeah, it's perfect. No, it's perfect. But as you look back, you're bringing words to this experience that you were curious about them and you wanted to know these people. When you were that age, did you have those words, or were you just fooling around? Were you conscious that these people were living in very...
I think I was just, no, I don't think I had those words. No, those come later in terms of making sense of this. No,
Right.
They don't make sense at the time, and it's not purposeful. I was just adventuresome. I was mischief. That's what it was at the time.
You wanted something, you were curious.
I was curious, wanted to try things, wanted to, I wasn't afraid.
So
Later on, you make sense of it.
Let's move on to your education. So you went to school, to college. What did you study?
I went to the University of Miami, primarily to play golf, and it made sense to me. I was a competitive golfer and pretty good, and that was a good place to go and play golf. And later on in college, and I was a good student, but I wasn't a really serious student. I applied myself to things that were interesting to me, and if it wasn't interesting to me, I didn't really apply myself. I mean, that's the way I was. I was a free spirit about things. as I think about that, there are other things that come,
We're good with the whiskey. We're good with the whiskey.
Right.
We're good with heating
my
up the
gosh,
whiskey for
okay,
breakfast.
Okay. So, but later on, like in the middle of my college career at University of Miami, I took a psychology class. And I had never taken a psychology class, didn't really know what psychology was, but as soon as I took that class, it just totally connected with me in terms of there's a whole field, there's a whole science about people and behavior and all those things that I think I was curious about. And I also took a sociology class, and that sparked me also. So in the middle of college, I all of a sudden became a very dedicated student. Like I couldn't get enough of those classes and frankly community work around that and ways to apply that and think about that. And in my senior year I didn't play golf. I had lost interest from a competitive standpoint and was really pursuing psychology, sociology, ended up going to graduate school. I have a master's in social work. Went to graduate school.
You're a social worker.
I have a master's in social work. I went to University of Maryland School of Social Work, and I just couldn't get enough. I mean, that just so met my internal need to try to be helpful and try to be connected and try to find ways that I could improve the lives of people that maybe weren't as lucky as me and were misrepresented or underrepresented. So it just launched me.
So what was your first job? What was your first job after this
After
education?
college?
Yeah, after this education.
Well, I was sure I wanted to work at a state hospital. There was one in Denver, Colorado that I particularly had my eye on, and I went out to Denver and I was sure they were waiting for me, and I just had to get there and let them know I was there and they'd have a job for me, and it didn't quite turn out that way. And then I sort of drifted around a little bit and I ended up back in Baltimore, Maryland. And this is before graduate school, so this is between college and graduate school. And I actually, I worked at an A&P grocery store, regional office in the mailroom, stuffing envelopes. But I ended up, my first job in that field, I got a job at a residential facility for teenagers that could not live at home, could not go to public schools, really were from a behavior standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, needed to be in a residential facility. And it was probably, had 30 kids, and I got a job there on the night shift.
Did you like it?
I loved it.
You loved it?
I loved it.
So how do we get from working the night shift, residential facility with kids, how did we get to Connecticut and the Connecticut Forum?
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Yeah. Let's see if I can make those connections. I also worked at a methadone maintenance clinic for heroin addicts. I worked at a state hospital, a large state hospital that was at the time for people who were mentally retarded. There were huge state hospitals at that time for this. And then I worked in community mental health. And I think it's the community mental health. I was the director of a community mental health center in New Jersey, and I also worked at a community mental health center in the Bronx. And I think it was that community work where it wasn't just about clinical work and it wasn't just about people's diagnoses and so on. It was about how does that all fit into the community, and how does the community play a role in that, and how can the community play a role in making that different and better.
And were you conscious of that at that time?
Totally. This was the beginning of the community mental health centers movement, and it was the end of institutionalization. So it was clear that I was part of something that was really ending and winding down large institutions of people, and part of starting something in terms of a community orientation to this.
So then how do we get to Connecticut and the Connecticut Forum?
Yeah.
It's not an easy jump.
Right. So in between there, in Richmond, I was also in the investment business for a period of time. And I actually moved to Connecticut to be part of the executive team at Advest.
And why did you decide to get a job at Advest? Why didn't you continue the community work?
Right.
What was the motivation?
I wanted to make more money.
Money?
I had a young family. I was working 14 hours a day in community mental health and that other work, and I did that on a sliding scale. I decided as a helping professional, you don't do that to make the most amount of money, you do that to provide the most amount of help.
So you made a practical decision.
I made an absolutely practical decision that I needed to make more money, and that that one of the ways that I could do that was to get into the investment field, and so I did that.
And so now we're working at Advest in Hartford.
And I was asked to come here by Advest, to move here by Advest, to help them be better known and more prominent in their home community. Advest had been here for 100 years as Putnam and Company. We had 800 employees here in Hartford, but it wasn't really well known. And they asked me to come here, run the headquarters branch, run the Connecticut division, help them
So you
really.
came here in management.
I came here in management and part of the executive team, and to help them really have more visibility in their home community. And so I drew from my community mental health experience when I came here. I said, what is this community? And that's sort of what you do in community mental health. You have to figure out what the community is and all the different elements of that community. So I did that here. And in doing some discovery in terms of what makes Greater Hartford and what about this community, I discovered some things. You know, I discovered the fact that it's not a community, it's a bunch of different little communities that don't necessarily connect to each other. I discovered that there's a certain amount of sort of negative self-image that exists here, you know, not really feeling good about itself.
The business of
You
being
know,
between Boston and New York.
And New York, and we're sort of a stepchild.
We're in the middle.
You know, there was real economic distress at that time. This is the late 80s and the early 90s, and there was a lot of dislocation of jobs and outsourcing and closing down and so on. So there was a lot of economic stress and distress. And I just looked at those things, and I said, we're in New England. There should be New England town halls. I mean, it's sort of something I've heard about all the time. There's a lot of really fascinating, interesting people that we don't get a chance to hear from. There's a lot of interesting topics that we don't really get a chance to talk about. Why don't we do a forum? I got together a group of 5 or 6 people at work and 5 or 6 friends, including my wife Doris, and some other dear friends, and I just shared this idea. What about something like that? Wouldn't this help the community? Wouldn't it be interesting? Wouldn't it be enjoyable? It's probably a little bit beyond. Probably
right,
beyond what
right.
people expected.
Right.
But again, it didn't seem that way to me. It's like, well, let's do it. And none of us had any experience at this, but the idea was pretty clear to me as to what it could be. In any case, and so I did some additional discovery. I talked to about 30 businesses to see if they would support the idea. And 29 of the 30 said they would support the idea, but many of them said to me, but you don't know Hartford, things like this just don't happen in Hartford. And my reaction to that was, that's great that I don't know Hartford and I don't know any better, because any thriving community needs to feel like new things can happen there, and big things can happen there. And that was part of the idea here, that Hartford needs to feel good about itself and needs to feel that big things can happen in Hartford. So that sort of encouraged me.
Who were your original sponsors? Like you said, you talked to a few corporations, 29 signed on. Who were the original ones?
Well, Travelers was part of it early on, and the Hartford Financial, the Hartford was part of it early on, the Hartford Current.
How did you have access to them?
I just called and went and visited.
Just cold called, like the
in some cases
the old,
I was
the
in some
old-fashioned
cases I was
way.
introduced to people, again because of my role here with the firm. In some cases I was introduced to people and accompanied by people. In other cases I just went and
So
visited.
you did it the old-fashioned way.
Went out and talked to people, and again, 29 of the 30 said they'd support it, but things like this don't happen in Hartford. And I just said, I just want to know if you'd support it. If we're lucky enough to make it happen, will you support it? And they said yes. They nodded their head the right way.
And then you started.
And so I went back to the groups and I said, I think there's enough support. Let's go. Let's do it. And then we looked around like, what do we have to do? We had to learn from scratch. I mean, there was no outline. It was really about, this is the truest example of a grassroots startup. You know, a small group of citizens can make a huge difference. This was a real example of that. And we just, you know, we got together. I mean, Doris, myself, Gina Clonan, our dear friend, a couple of other folks, and we just said, let's go. We need to find some panelists. How do you find panelists? We need to put together a season. Let's talk about what that could look like. And we created a season, and we went out and talked with panelists and found agents and found people, and the sponsors had made that commitment, and people had to become subscribers. And I want to say it was October. It was a couple weeks before the first Clinton election in 1992. We did a forum on the changing political landscape, and we had panelists there, and 2,400 people in the audience, and it was like, I guess.
How did they get there?
I guess
it worked.
I guess it works.
Right.
I guess they got it.
Right.
And that was the start of the Connecticut Forum. And frankly, I like the fact that we were innocent and that we were full of energy and passion, and we just couldn't see any way that it couldn't work. And we just moved forward. So that's the start of the Connecticut Forum. Here we are 26 years later. You know, the Connecticut Forum continues to be that sort of organization and bring that sort of energy and stimulation to Greater Hartford.
So now you're also the president. Your wife, Doris Sugarman, is still running the Connecticut Forum.
Doris is the executive director.
And you're still bringing in 2,800 people 4 times a year.
Yep.
But now you have a new position. You're Hartford Promise.
Correct. I'm also the president of Hartford Promise.
What does Hartford Promise do?
So we are a large-scale scholarship fund and college success program. And the way to think about this, unlike other scholarships, it's place-based, and the place is Hartford. So if you're a Hartford resident and you go to a Hartford Public High School and you have a 3.0 GPA and 93% attendance, if you hit those 4 things, you become a Hartford Promise Scholar. And that means you get a $20,000 scholarship to any college or university in the country. And you also are then part of the Promise community, where we become part of your resource team and your success team in college. And we continue to be connected with you and help you connect with other resources so that you can get through that transition and then move on successfully in college.
How many kids do you have in that?
So we've been doing this 3 years now, and we have 400 Hartford Promise Scholars. So when I say large scale,
Very large
unlike
scale.
a couple of lucky kids, 400 Hartford Promise Scholars going to 60 different colleges all over the country.
So I started, when we first started speaking, I said you are the original social entrepreneur before the word was invented. So give me the advice that you would tell the millennial community now, because they all want to be social entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
What would you tell them to do?
Well, I wouldn't just say this to the millennial community. I think there are a lot of people at all ages that have a lot to contribute to the world and to creating better lives. You know, what would I say? What advice would I offer? I would say find something that you feel really connected to. People, a cause, a theme, an issue, an idea that you feel really connected to. And then be bold. Don't put risk too early in the process. It's real easy, especially in Hartford, Connecticut, the insurance capital. You know, there's a lot of actuarial thinking that goes on around here where risk aversion and risk management becomes, I don't think that works early in the process. I think early in the process got to be the sense of connection, the sense of being bold, and you can do it. I think it's really important to get a handful of talented people around you who bring other skills and other perspectives than what you have. Don't be afraid of that. That's really the fuel and energy for success, is having that diversity of views and people who will do things. You can assess the risk a little later. You know, you need to get started, you know, and if the risk is there too early, you don't ever get started. So I think that would be my sort of core advice, is those few things.
We've been talking to Richard Sugarman, and I guess what we get from this entire conversation is, number 1, to be bold, and number 2, be risk averse. Just be risk averse. Don't think about risk. Think about what you can do. Don't think about what you can't do. Does that sound right?
I think that's fair. I wouldn't say totally risk averse. I would say there's a time and place for risk assessment.
And the beginning is not the time.
The beginning is not necessarily the time.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Real a pleasure,
Thank
Pat.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of fun.
Yeah.